Spike wins a game of pool at the billiards bar the C'est La Vie, and celebrates in silence with a drink and a smoke before beginning the walk back to his ship, the Swordfish 2. He strolls down a dim alleyway, as calm and drifting as the quiet night air he's walking through, unaware that this night will bring him to potentially the peak of his limits both physically and psychologically, and perhaps closer to death than he's ever been before. Before digging into what is so special about this specific adventure of the Bebop crew, we need to first remember some key truths about the nature of Cowboy Bebop, and more specifically, the nature of one Spike Spiegel. Spike is a dead man walking. As you watch through his odyssey, you come to the conclusion that his past is influencing his future more than he can. His continued existence is growing ever more eclipsed by what he's trying so desperately to escape from. He's got an aura of invincibility to him, but it isn't a triumphant superhero type of invincibility, it's more of a death sentence. He's a tiger-striped cat who's lived a million lives, died and revived a million times. Even though he comes off as this unstoppable force, it's like he's fated to die one way, and one way only. Imprisoned by fate, he drifts through his days. Stuck living in a dream he can't wake up from.
Look at my eyes, Faye. One of them is a fake because I lost it in an accident. Since then, I've been seeing the past in one eye and the present in the other. I felt like I was watching a dream I'd never wake up from. Before I knew it, the dream was all over.
Young jazz men with a new sense are gathering. At last, they created a new genre itself. They're sick and tired of the conventional fixed-style jazz. They're eager to play jazz more freely, as they wish. Then, in 2071, the bounty hunters, who are gathering in the spaceship Bebop, will play freely without fear of risk. They must create new dreams and new films by breaking traditional styles. The work, which becomes a new genre itself, will be called Cowboy Bebop. This is in many ways Cowboy Bebop's manifesto. This text can be spotted scattered throughout the show, and while it's mainly referring to the characters and the plot, it's also clearly talking about Cowboy Bebop itself. Where Bebop is the story of young men gathering to express themselves through jazz, free of labels, Cowboy Bebop is the story of young animators gathering to express themselves through storytelling, free of genre. It basically calls itself the jazz of media, which is a pretty lofty claim for any show to make. Except for one. Will this next episode be a fun romp with our characters, a gut-wrenchingly somber legend, an action thriller, a comedy horror, a character drama, a blaxploitation? Bebop is by nature varied in all ways it can be. So if every episode is slated to be different, it could be inferred that the most different, distinct episode would clearly be the one of most intrigue. The one most bizarre would by nature be the most Bebop. And I'm here to say that without a doubt in my mind, this episode is more unique than any other before or after it.
Hello, boy.
To start off, this episode is the only one in the series to utilize digital coloring rather than traditional hand-painted cells. If you weren't paying attention to it, a person likely wouldn't notice, but the alien or otherworldly vibe it gives off does not go unnoticed. Second of all, this show genre hops a lot. Sometimes it's a Greek tragedy, sometimes it's slapstick, but the one that's always been the most interesting to me is horror. Now, it might not seem like it at first glance, but this show dips its toes into the horror-scape quite a bit. Moments like Episode 5, The Ballad of Fallen Angels, when Faye sits down at the opera and sees what Vicious did to Mao Yenrai. We get body horror just an episode later in Session 6, Sympathy for the Devil, when Wen ages about half a century in just a few seconds and shrivels up like a raisin. We even get psychological horror later in the series, Session 23, Brain Scratch. And let's not forget Toys in the Attic, Session 11, where we get an entire episode of Alien/2001: A Space Odyssey. But there is nothing in this saga as grim and unyielding as Mad Pierrot. Otherwise known as Tong Pu, he was a man that underwent many horrific, mind-altering experiments at the ISSP Assassination Skills Enhancement Experiment Research Facility. It's unknown how this Tong Pu found himself in this situation. Maybe he was a prisoner or a soldier, but this was clearly thrust upon him with no choice. The experiments worked, granting Tong Pu abilities no mortal man could ever achieve. Effortless levitation, incredible speeds, and a personal kinetic force field. Pierrot is unlike any other antagonist of Cowboy Bebop. The entire power dynamic of this universe shifts with this man. You can't shoot him, you can't blow him up. He's basically in creative mode. He instills a feeling of hopelessness that few other enemies in fiction possess, in my opinion. He holds all the cards. But I regretted to mention the one drawback of all these experiments, which subsequently is the most horrifying thing about Tong Pu. This was the mental toll that it took on him, and how it would transform him into the mythic Mad Pierrot. He sustained major psychological regression during the testing, which resulted in him having the mentality of a child, no more than 6 or 7 years old. Because of this, the experiment would be cancelled and deemed a failure. Tong Pu was to be permanently quarantined, locked in a padded cell for the rest of his life. Truly the scariest character, the innocence and impulsivity of a child, twisted and eroded by lapses in his sanity. As Jet said,
"So he's like a child with superhuman combat capabilities. And really, there's nothing more pure and cruel as a child."
using his unrivaled power, he slaughtered all the researchers and has been on a prolific spree of murder ever since. This is my favorite breaking point moment in all of cinema. This dichotomy between child and monster is what fuels this episode's feeling of uneasiness at its conclusion. It forces an ultimatum on your brain, one of neutralizing a threat versus helping a victim. I was going to try to talk more about what makes him so scary outside of the context of Spike, but I quickly realized that these characters are intrinsically locked together. The reason Pierrot is so terrifying is because he shows us something we've never seen before: terror in the eyes of Spike Spiegel. Remember earlier when I referred to Spike as an unstoppable force? Well, if that's true, then Pierrot is an immovable object. The entire formula of this show, the entire dynamic, is Spike hunting down bounty heads, but this was not a mission. Spike just wandered down the wrong alley at the wrong time, and the only two explanations of how he got away with his life are up to just two factors: luck and fate. Instead of Spike hunting a bounty, he was the prey being hunted. Spike's petrified nature in this session is what makes it so appealing. By the seemingly most eloquent fighter being completely overpowered like this, by stripping away every ounce of power and leverage Spike has on the situation, it gives him more humanity than arguably any other scene. I mean, come on, this guy that did this is over here getting comboed. I mean, come on, think of all the shit that Spike Spiegel has survived. He was choked out by a coked up freak who was huffing super soldier serum. He navigated a patch of space with hundreds of laser guided kill bots. All of this shit with Andy. This motherfucker feels invincible. Then you get to this episode and we get a cruel reminder that Spike is vincible as hell. Something that should go without saying is that this show has a very strong link to music. It has one of the most eclectic and important soundtracks of anything ever, and is conceptually musical. And one of the things that makes me give this episode its coveted title of the most unique is its use of music, or lack thereof. Every episode of this series punctuates its most important scenes with bombastic, passionate music, but this episode just lets you rot in the silence. Then, when it finally breaks that silence and gives us music, it's the distorted sound of carnival music. Childlike and twisted to an unnerving point, perfectly echoing Pierrot himself. Spaceland is one of the most visually stunning arenas in Cowboy Bebop, and that's coming from a show with fights like this. And this. And this. I didn't want to clutter the first half of this video, so I chose not to bring this up until now, but Mad Pierrot has a curious revulsion to cats. While he was being tortured by the scientists, there was another figure there, looming, one that would burn itself into his psyche. The reason I bring this up is not only because it leads to Spike gaining the only leverage he can possibly get on him later in the episode, entirely unwittingly, might I add, but this moment sets up my favorite detail in all of Cowboy Bebop. Have a look. As Spike's artificial right eye shines from the light of the incoming parade, the very same eye that has Spike stuck living in a dream, it shocks Pierrot, reminding him of the ever-looming cat. But why would seeing Spike make him so hesitant? Well...
Ever heard this story?
Huh?
There once was a tiger-striped cat. This cat died 1 million deaths, revived and lived 1 million lives, and he was owned by various people who he didn't really care for. The cat wasn't afraid to die. The tiger-striped cat cried 1 million times, and then he died too. Except this time, he didn't come back to life. Bang.
By far, the X factor of this episode is Spike's obliviousness to Pierrot's nature. Spike didn't have the exposition we got. He doesn't know that he has the mind of a child or that he had been tortured. All Spike knows is that this unstoppable, unkillable, maniacal freak has chosen to exterminate him. Spike finally manages to cause damage to him using a hidden blade, taking advantage of how Pierrot's kinetic barrier functions. Expecting to have at most just made things slightly easier for himself, Spike is obviously confused when Pierrot wails out in pain like a young child and falls to the ground. Pierrot is crushed under the feet of the brightly colored parade that marches through Spaceland. The eerie carnival tune echoes throughout the scene just as it did through Pierrot himself. Jet calls Spike, finally bearing the information about his past in hopes of finding some weakness. Spike's unshakable, cold demeanor winces as he responds.
Spike, listen. We figured out what he is. He's a...
Forget it. I don't need the info anymore.